Hello, everybody. Sunday afternoon here, cutting this video for us. This week, in both White and Long, we are looking at the issue of space for worship. This is one of those issues that we give very little thought to, and it also sets the thought for every single worship service that we have. The little statement I used at the top, we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. We shape our buildings and then our buildings restrict, form, control the way that we worship. Even the most formal among us, even the most traditional among us, long for new and creative ways to worship God. And sometimes the biggest obstacle to that is not the unwillingness of our people, but often the space that we have, the space that other people maybe had built for us. And we're going to talk about architecture. So you got these two tensions that are going on here with worship space. One, obviously, like I said at the beginning, you're reading White, man, that is the encyclopedia of worship. So we have all of this rich theological tradition that obviously predates a lot of things on the disciples movement on the American frontier and 21st century facilities. So you got all of this rich Christian history of architecture that's worth understanding and worth knowing. And then you go to Long and you have all of these contemporary issues of the way that people gather for worship. Now, let me go back about 80 years here. If you read Lal Schaller, he was the preeminent church consultant of the 20th century. The joke about Lal Schaller was he never had an unpublished thought. So if you get on Amazon and Google Lal Schaller, you're probably going to find, I'm not kidding, maybe 80 books of his that he wrote. He was writing right up until the end of his life. Lal Schaller talked about that the biggest change, one of the biggest changes to Christian architecture was the parking lot. And so if you have ever been a member of an old downtown church, you probably have struggled with parking. And so he said that when the automobile became the go-to mode for the way that people came to worship, it really changed everything, because you had to have almost twice to three times as much property, and your seating capacity had to match your parking capacity. And then since then, obviously, people come to church in different ways. You used to get mom and dad and 2.5 kids that piled into the car. Now we know that is not the case. Some people will come that live together or are married or partnered. They'll bring two automobiles to church because one of them's going to work and one of them's staying late for a Christian Ed meeting or whatever. So the parking lot. So I'm rambling on, but I say all that to say parking lots shaped the way that we do church. And even as we understand the deep theological conviction of so much of Christian architecture, it collides with practical realities that perhaps were not on the forefront of people's mind in the Middle Ages. So I want to walk through the 7 points of Christian geography, of Christian architecture that Long walks and talks through. Some of them, I think he has some pretty good thoughts. He distinctly left a couple things off. I'll talk about those a little bit. But let's just kind of walk through these. I'm going to give you my insight, and I'm going to do this as if we're looking at that second paper. So that second paper, we craft a worship service start to finish exactly the way we would want it. That is has mission on its mind, that is flexible in terms of architecture. You can create your own church building in which this worship space in which this worship service takes place. But in each of these pointers, each of these issues that Long lifts up, I'm going to talk a little bit about the functionality as well as the missional component that I think are strong in each of these that you would do well to have a better understanding of in the context that you're in for ministry. Long talks about the gathering space that needs to be there. I'm not an architect, but I've sat through a lot of church building meetings. You need a space right off the worship space that people can gather, where people can have big foyers, high ceilings, and feel as if they can linger there, and it is built for people to hang out. I always measure the health of a worship service by how fast the people leave the service. And if you have a space where people want to show up early, drink coffee, be together, come into worship, And then when worship is over, there should be like these series of relational roadblocks that keep people from making their way out. So the ideal gathering space, some call it a narthex, some call it a foyer. I just like a big gathering area. The ideal goal of that is for life on life. And you want people to stick around before get there early and then stick around when worship is over. Church I served in Iowa, First Christian Church, Keokuk, Iowa. They relocated to an empty Walmart right before I became the minister. They bought a 100,000 square foot Walmart and remodeled it. They were a church of 350 people in a 100-plus-year-old congregation where they would put over 300 people in the sanctuary. And then their gathering area, I kid you not, I can't show you in my office at home, but it was, it was like a large bedroom. It barely could fit like 30 people in there. And my dad, who I followed, who had been the minister there for 26 years, used to call it like an ejector chute. So you'd have this vibrant, Christ-centered worship. And every minister's goal is to get people to linger and stick around. And that's where relationships are formed. That's how you get somebody to serve on the board. And everybody just shot their way out into the parking lot. And in December in Iowa, that is not where you want to be. And so gathering spaces allow for relational warmth and missional activity. Second thing that Long talks about there is that in your worship space, you need a spot for movement to take place, for people to be able to come forward to receive communion. In my church, at our 9:30 service, one of the practices that we had, obviously not during COVID, was an opportunity to come forward and be prayed for, like a literal, joining of the hands and praying with an elder or a minister, or laying on hands to pray when we would come forward for communion. We have 2 kneelers that are actually stationed there at the base of the stage for people to come and have this physical manifestation of worship. People may not be opposed to that, but sometimes the biggest roadblocks are not the willingness of the people, but there's no space for it. Every pew is nailed and screwed down into the ground, and you can't create any space for people to engage worship through their body. I get that coming forward for communion can be harder for some. Obviously, COVID has put a lot of that on hold. That said, if you're creating a space for worship from scratch, you want there to be freedom for people to move. You want there to be a sense that movement is celebrated here. And that doesn't have to be a dance team. That doesn't have to have, liturgical banners and dancers. But I'm telling you, the idea that we come, sit, consume, leave is a theological statement. We are saying a lot about what we believe is asked of worshipers during worship. And it says a lot about what we assume will or will not happen in worship. And so think about the way that movement or the lack thereof shapes the way that we worship. I would aim to have nothing nailed down to the floor if I were to ever start a new church again, or if I were to build a new worship space from scratch, that everything was movable. That way you could move the communion table to the center and have a church in the round and have movement for that. That way the first 3 rows can be moved or rearranged so that you can have a drama in the front, or that you can have different ways for the consecration of leaders. Think about what movements are limited in the space that you have. Think about congregational space. I know that the short term for that would just be the sanctuary, and that makes sense. I love what Long talks about, that you also want there to be an element of light and flexibility on the chancel. I know we might call it the stage, you might call it the chancel, you might just call it the 2 steps up and there you are. But I think also the way that I don't want anything nailed to the ground in the worship space, everything on the chancel we want to have is flexible as well. If you could split, we talked a lot about technology and how we could invest in technology, especially with that COVID has shaped us. If I could put money into something in a county seat church that I was serving, or a small country church I was serving, it would be lighting on the chancel. If we talk about worship as community theater, we wouldn't dare, even with the most lowbrow ragtag community theater, not have appropriate lighting that would set the scene. And so maybe the lighting should be different for the preaching of the word than it is a communal confession of sin. or on Easter when you stand to sing the Alleluia chorus, that lighting better be different than were you there when they crucified my Lord. And so I think this is one of those underutilized gifts that God has given us in our technology is lighting. So take a look at that in terms of congregational space in the way that the lighting takes place. Long also talks about the way that that we would space the choir. The way that we would space the choir. I'm going to go out on a ledge here theologically. It is okay for your choir to be up there, visible, with eyes on them. It is okay for your praise team or your lead singers to be up front and to be set apart and to do that. I think of that as a form of Christian leadership. Leading the church in the worship of God through music is a form of leadership. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with, I don't feel the need to diminish that. Now, we don't want to put people on a platform, but I think sometimes we are more concerned about someone standing out with their giftedness than we are letting those with gifts to lead. And I think it's okay to let those with the gifts to lead music and worship to do that. And so I'm all for a choir loft that's visible. Little Baptist church down the street from me in the hometown I grew up in, their choir loft was in the balcony. And I never could quite get that. Nobody could see them. I know that there was probably a good nature to that, but at the same time, I'm not preaching from the balcony. We're not having elders who we literally consecrate and set apart to pray over the table, praying from the balcony. If we want in the end, worship leaders and singers and choir are kind of the ones that are calling forth the worship from the church. Let them call forth the worship from the church. Let them be the drum majors that bring it out of the people. And so that's why I'm a big fan of that. You'll always don't let the one person that wants the spotlight keep you from utilizing the rest of the folks that simply want to see the church worship God with vibrancy and faith. So that's my little soapbox that I stepped up on. Also, we're looking at the communion table. Once again, I think the communion table should be flexible, something that you can wheel down into the center of the worship space if need be. I have this terrible metaphor. I've been told it's bad, but I'm a big fan of it. People pushing the cart through the hospital with food on it. I would love a communion table on wheels that you could literally push through the pews and distribute to people in need that which will nourish them, that which will feed them. I think the stapling to the ground of 100-pound communion tables that take 6 men under 40 to move, and you don't have 6 men under 40 in your church, I think that limits us in terms of mission, in terms of Christology. How do you set up a communion table in the parking lot to be a reminder that the gospel sends us out from this place into the community? I think the communion table needs a sense of flexibility, and I hope that you can find a way to move it. But if you can't move it, it should be at the dead center of the worship. It should be at the center of the chancel on the floor. You didn't ask for my authoritative opinion. That's it. I like the communion table at the center because Christ is at the center, and I like it on the floor because at the foot of the cross, the gospel, it is flat. We're all sinners in need of grace, and no one has more access to it than anyone else. Baptismals. I think we're all disciples on this group, and so we're looking at the baptistry where we get in and we immerse people. One little thing for you: if your baptistry is currently used for storage until the one time a year that it is used, you are telling your church everything you believe about evangelism. Even if you have to go get a storage unit on the edge of town to put your stuff in, do not use your baptistry for storage. Fill that thing up and make sure that it works, and begin to preach and worship in anticipation that God will lead someone to faith and desire to be baptized through immersion. The theology that we communicate through our baptistry has less to do with the location of it in our worship space and more about the way that we don't even keep it up because it's been so long since we baptized somebody around here. I know this isn't a church revitalization seminar, But I'm telling you, if your baptistry is being used to store things, your church is going to close. And I think the first step that you can do in faith is to get some folks that know how to make sure that thing is running and make sure the heater works, and go up one Saturday and fill that thing up and make sure that it works, and then begin to pray that God would send someone and use you to bring someone to it. Since we do have the baptistry, I like the function of the table on the floor, the choir loft, and then the baptistry at the center of the back of the worship, or the center of the front of the worship space. I am a big fan of the baptistry. If you don't have, when I planted a church twice, we had a portable baptistry. We went to Farm and Fleet and bought a hog tank or a farm tank, a stock tank, and filled that thing up. It came between my knees and my waist, so I had to really get somebody down there to lift them up. But we would do those in the parking lot, and those were huge celebrations. And so when you're thinking about the space that you have and you utilize for baptisms, what are the limitations of the celebration of baptism by the way that you baptize and the location that you baptize? At our church, in our sanctuary, where we have our 11 o'clock service, I don't have the courage to do this yet, and I can't do it till COVID is way in the rearview mirror. But I'm telling you, I'm a coward. I'm not going to do this for a long time, but I'd like to. We have huge sanctuary. I want to see the next person that's baptized, rather than everyone sitting where they are, I want to bring everybody up, almost like shoulder to shoulder, back to back, get as close as we can to that baptistry. And then after they've been baptized, everybody comes through and puts their hand in the water as a sign of connection with them. How do you use your space that you have to invite people into a deep experience of celebration because someone was baptized? Finally, we have the table, we have the baptistry, and then we look at the pulpit and the lectern. I want to go back to two things on this that I said before. One, I do think it's important that I do think lighting is not inconsequential to the space that we use for the preaching of the word and the reading of the word. This is one of those things that we talked about last week, the balance between excellence and authenticity. You can value the authenticity of a person that's giving the morning prayer, and at the same time coach them how to give a better morning prayer. You can do both of those things. So you look at the lectern on one side, the pulpit on the other, or maybe it's all just in one spot, depending on the architecture that you have of your church. But never forget, these are tools. These are not, these are tools. These are to be used to help you. And so if you start your sermon in the pulpit and then wander down into the pews, that's just fine. If you I don't want to tell you to scrap the pulpit at your church. That's the easy way to get fired. But if you have a huge pulpit and everybody's sitting in the back row, man, pick up a music stand and come stand on the third row in the center aisle and watch how everyone changes. These are all tools. And so when you feel as if something is literally nailed to the ground in terms of the pulpit, don't be afraid to stretch that for a little bit of flexibility. For me, at our 11 o'clock service, or at our 9:30 service, I can wander around the stage a little bit. We've got a lit stage, and I kind of know the parameters of how far I can go. But at our 11 o'clock service, up 3 steps to the chancel, and then from the chancel, there's a pulpit. I got to go up 2 steps. I mean, like, I am up there in the air, and it's a little awkward at times. But that said, sometimes you can maximize the deficiencies that you have. And so just think about the way, how is your pulpit and lectern a resource for you in communicating the gospel? So that's what I have on worship in space. Those are the 7 issues that Long wanted us to look at. I want you to look at one issue that you feel is, of those 7, which one in terms of your church architecture is well served for mission and for worship? And then kind of, if you could change one thing, like where do you know you have a deficiency among one of those 7 in your church facility? I know some of you are worshiping, I think, in a bank community room. I get that. Just be creative. Think about the space that you're in and what is the advantages and what are the disadvantages. You can sprinkle through white. You can. I should have made this clear. and you'll get it by watching all the way through the end. White is a great resource. If you can use it, great. But if you don't reference White, it's not the end of the world. I'm asking you to read it because I think it's helpful to you. And I think it's one of those things that you can express in writing without even having to cite paper and or page and footnote. Don't worry about that. Spend your time wrestling with Long's 7 pointers, one that is an advantage, one that is a disadvantage. And if you can use resources from James White, even better. All right. Thank you all. I will touch base with you soon.